Chapter 1. Pascagoula Incident, 1973. Fishermen Hickson and Parker are abducted. The humid air of a Mississippi October evening clung to the banks of the Pascagoula River, a heavy, warm blanket woven with the scents of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sun had long since surrendered its dominion to a sky of deepening indigo, and the water, once a shimmering ribbon of gold, now lay like a placid, inky mirror reflecting the first hesitant stars. For Charles Hickson, 42, and Calvin Parker, 19, the fading light signaled the approach of that perfect, quiet hour when the fish were said to bite best. Their small boat drifted gently in the current near an abandoned shipyard, the rhythmic lapping of water against the hull a soft, lulling percussion against the steady thrum of crickets and the occasional deep croak of a bullfrog from the shore. It was an evening steeped in the profound and simple tranquility that men seek when they cast a line into the water, a temporary reprieve from the demands of the shipyard where they both worked. The world was reduced to the gentle tug on a line, the shared silence between friends, and the vast, peaceful darkness overhead. Hickson, a man settled into the comfortable certainties of middle age, leaned back, his thoughts drifting as aimlessly as the boat itself. He contemplated the mortgage, the reliable rhythm of his job, the small satisfactions of a life built with his own two hands. Parker, younger and perched at the precipice of his own future, felt the familiar restlessness of youth, his mind a whirlwind of girls and cars and the vague, unformed shape of the man he hoped to become. The silence between them was not empty, but full, a testament to an easy companionship that required few words. They were just two ordinary men enjoying an ordinary southern evening, suspended in a moment of sublime peace that felt as if it could stretch into eternity. But eternity, as they were about to discover, held dimensions they could not possibly have imagined. It began not with a bang, but with a soft, unnatural hum, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated deep within their bones, silencing the crickets and stilling the very air around them. Hickson was the first to notice the light, a pale bluish glow that coalesced out of the darkness behind them, growing in intensity until it bathed the derelict shipyard in an ethereal, sterile luminescence. He turned, his fishing rod forgotten in his hand, and his breath caught in his throat. Suspended above the water, no more than 40 feet away, was an object. It was roughly football-shaped, about 30 feet long and perhaps 10 feet high, and it possessed a soft, matte gray surface that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. There were no seams, no rivets, no visible means of propulsion, only the impossibly smooth hull and two pulsating blue lights that cast strange, dancing shadows on the water below. The hum intensified, a resonant, vibratory pressure that made their teeth ache. Parker was frozen, his youthful face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief, his eyes wide with a terror that was primal and absolute. All thoughts of fishing, of the future, of the ordinary world were instantly vaporized. From an opening that appeared in the seamless surface, 3 figures emerged. They were not tall, perhaps 5 feet in height, their skin a pale wrinkled gray like an elephant's hide. They had no discernible necks, their heads appearing to fuse directly into their shoulders. Where a nose and mouth should have been, there were only thin, slit-like openings, and 2 similar slits served as eyes. In place of hands, they had pincer-like claws, and their legs seemed fused together, their movement a strange, robotic floating rather than a walk. 2 of the beings seized Hickson, their touch surprisingly light, yet inescapable. He felt a peculiar numbness spread through his body, a paralysis that was not born of fear, but seemed to be an externally applied property of their grip. He tried to struggle, to cry out, but his muscles would not obey, his vocal cords producing no sound. He felt himself being lifted, floating effortlessly toward the humming craft, his mind screaming in silent protest. The interior was as Spartan and strange as the exterior, a single brightly lit room with no visible controls or equipment. Hickson was laid upon a table where a large eye-like device descended from the ceiling, scanning his body from head to toe. It moved with a slow, methodical grace, its gaze both clinical and deeply invasive. There was no pain, only a profound sense of violation, of being analyzed like a biological specimen. He could see Parker nearby, similarly immobilized, his eyes wide with a catatonic terror that mirrored his own. The examination, or whatever it was, seemed to last an eternity and no time at all. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. He felt himself floating again, carried out of the craft and gently deposited back onto the muddy riverbank beside a similarly stunned and trembling Calvin Parker. For a long moment they simply lay there, the damp earth cold against their backs, the familiar sounds of the night slowly returning as if from a great distance. The crickets tentatively resumed their chorus. The blue lights of the craft pulsed once, twice, and then shot upward into the night sky, disappearing in an instant. The unnatural hum was gone, replaced by the pounding of their own hearts. They looked at each other, their faces pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. No words were needed to confirm what had happened. The shared reality of the experience was a palpable, terrifying presence between them. The ordinary world had been shattered. After a period of stunned silence that stretched for nearly an hour, punctuated only by Parker's intermittent sobs, Hickson, the older man, the foreman, found his voice. It was raspy, thin, but firm with a new, terrible resolve. "We have to tell someone," he said, the words cutting through the fragile peace of the restored night. The quiet evening was over. Chapter 2. Pascagoula Interrogation, 1973. A secret police tape confirms their fear. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office was a world away from the organic darkness of the Pascagoula River. Here, the light was artificial and unforgiving, the harsh glare of fluorescent tubes bouncing off beige linoleum floors and the cold, gray metal of government-issued desks. The air smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint, acrid tang of disinfectant. It was a place built for processing the mundane troubles of humanity, drunks, domestic disputes, petty theft, not for tales of egg-shaped crafts and gray, robotic beings. Captain Glenn Ryder, a man whose career had been forged in the crucible of verifiable facts and tangible evidence, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Across the desk from him sat Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, two men who looked as though they had been pulled through the ragged edge of reality and had not yet found their footing on the other side. Hickson was trying to maintain a semblance of composure, but his hands trembled and his voice was strained. Parker was a wreck, periodically breaking into uncontrollable sobs, his young face crumpled in a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. Ryder had seen fear before. He had seen it in the eyes of hardened criminals and terrified victims. But this was different. This was not the fear of being caught, nor the fear of a human assailant. It was a deeper, more existential dread, a terror that seemed to have shaken the very foundations of their sanity. He listened to their story, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable authenticity of their distress. Men could lie, especially for attention, but it was hard to fake the kind of profound shock that radiated from the two men before him. He studied their faces, their body language, the way their eyes darted around the room as if expecting the walls to dissolve. He thought of his duty, of the paperwork, of the inevitable ridicule that would follow if he took this seriously. Yet something in Hickson's steady, pleading gaze and Parker's complete collapse compelled him to push further. He needed something more, something that could exist beyond their subjective and possibly hysterical testimony. An idea formed in his mind, a classic investigative trick. "All right, fellas," Ryder said, his voice gentle but firm. "I want you to sit in here for a bit. Just relax. We're going to leave you alone for a while to collect your thoughts. We'll be right outside." He led them to a small, featureless room, furnished with only a table and a few chairs. He offered them coffee, which they numbly accepted. What Hickson and Parker did not know was that a concealed tape recorder was running, its spools turning silently, capturing every word, every sigh, every sob. The officers gathered in the next room, listening to the feed, expecting to hear the conspiratorial whispers of a hoax being concocted, the relief of two men who had pulled one over on the law. Instead, what they heard chilled them to the bone. The conversation that unfolded in that small, sterile room was not of deception, but of shared, desperate confusion and terror. It was the sound of two minds struggling to process the impossible. "I got to get home and get to bed," Parker's voice trembled on the tape, thick with emotion. Hickson, trying to be the steadying older figure, his own voice shaky. "I know, Calvin, I know, but they can't believe it. They're not going to believe it." Parker's voice rose in a desperate pleading wail. "I can't take it. I want to see a doctor." For the next 30 minutes, the officers listened in stunned silence as the two men rehashed the event, not for an audience, but for each other. They spoke of the paralyzing light, the coldness of the examination, the eye-like machine that scanned them. Parker prayed aloud, his voice cracking with a fear so raw and genuine it was painful to hear. Hickson tried to soothe him, his words a mantra of disbelief and shock. "My God, it's awful. I know it's something you can't believe. I never thought." There was no hint of a story being crafted, no sign of a lie. There was only the raw, unfiltered sound of trauma. Captain Ryder felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was a lawman, a creature of logic and procedure, but the voices on that tape defied any logical explanation he could conjure. These men believed what they were saying. More than that, they were utterly shattered by it. The experience, whatever it was real to them. His perspective as an investigator began a slow, seismic shift. The initial skepticism he had cultivated over a long career began to crumble, replaced by a reluctant, uneasy belief. He was no longer dealing with a potential hoax. He was dealing with two profoundly traumatized victims. The question was, victims of what? He made a decision. The men would be sent to Keesler Air Force Base for a more thorough physical examination. He also arranged for polygraph tests, the closest thing his world had to a mechanical truth-teller. The results, when they came back, were unequivocal. Both men, the examiner concluded, were telling the truth as they knew it. The initial medical reports from the base hospital noted nothing more than minor scratches and what appeared to be puncture marks, findings that were inconclusive on their own. But coupled with the polygraph results and the harrowing audio from the secret recording, they painted a disturbing picture. The case, once a bizarre interruption to a quiet night, was now a documented, official anomaly. It had acquired a file number, a stack of paperwork, and the grim weight of bureaucratic reality. Captain Ryder sat alone in his office late that night, the hum of the fluorescent lights now seeming to mock the profound silence of the cosmos. He thought of the sounds of the river at night, a peace he had always taken for granted. For Hickson and Parker, that peace was gone forever, replaced by a terrifying new knowledge. And for Ryder himself, the solid ground of his orderly world now felt strangely unstable, as if he too were standing on the banks of a dark river, staring at a strange light that had no business being there. The file on his desk was no longer just a story. It was a question mark, aimed at the very heart of what was considered possible. Chapter 3. Betty and Barney Hill Case, 1961. Couple encounters UFO, experiences missing time. 12 years before the Pascagoula incident shattered the quiet of a Mississippi evening, another journey home, on another dark rural road, had already sketched the terrifying blueprint for what would become known as the abduction phenomenon. The year was 1961, a time of burgeoning optimism and Cold War paranoia, when the heavens were seen as the next frontier for human ambition, not a source of silent, watchful visitors. Betty and Barney Hill were driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire, returning from a brief vacation in Canada. The late hour, just past 10 o'clock on the evening of September 19th, had emptied the roads, leaving their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, an isolated capsule of light and warmth, hurtling through a vast, sleeping landscape. Betty, a social worker, and Barney, a postal employee, were a striking couple, not just for their evident affection, but for the simple fact of their union. In the still deeply segregated America of the early 60s, they were an interracial couple, a quiet testament to a love that defied the rigid social codes of their time. They were used to navigating the subtle and overt challenges of their world with a quiet dignity and resilience. They were not, however, prepared for a challenge that came from beyond their world entirely. Betty was the first to see it, a point of light moving erratically against the backdrop of the star-dusted moonlit sky. It was brighter than any star, and it wasn't following the path of a conventional aircraft or satellite. She watched it for a time, her curiosity piqued, thinking it might be a military patrol or some new piece of Cold War technology. Barney, ever the pragmatist, was more dismissive, focused only on the long miles ahead. But the light grew closer, descending, its movements becoming more deliberate, seeming to pace their car as it wound through the dark, lonely stretch of U.S. Route 3. The atmosphere inside the car began to shift. The easy comfort of the long drive evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The surrounding forest, once a majestic, sleeping giant, now felt oppressive and menacing, its dense blackness pressing in on them. The world outside their windows was becoming alien territory. Barney, increasingly unnerved by Betty's insistence, finally pulled the car over. He stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, grabbing a pair of binoculars from the seat. He raised them to his eyes, scanning the sky until he found the object. It was no longer a point of light. It was a large, flattened, circular craft, now hovering silently, less than 100 feet above them. A row of windows pulsed with a brilliant white light, and through the binoculars, Barney could make out figures moving behind them. They were not human. A cold dread, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over him. He felt an overwhelming, instinctive command in his mind. Don't look. Get back in the car. Stay on the road and keep looking. But he was frozen, mesmerized by the silent spectacle. He lowered the binoculars and saw one of the figures staring directly at him, a telepathic message seeming to pass between them, a sense of intelligent, non-human consciousness that was both terrifying and profound. He scrambled back into the car, his face ashen, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "They're going to capture us," he yelled, fumbling with the ignition. He threw the car into gear, tires screeching on the pavement as he sped away, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The craft descended lower, positioning itself directly above them. The world inside the Chevrolet then dissolved into a strange, rhythmic buzzing and beeping sound. A peculiar drowsiness overcame them, a sensation not of sleep, but of a conscious, altered state, as if time itself were stretching and thinning. The familiar reality of the dashboard, the hum of the engine, the feeling of the road beneath the tires, it all faded into a disconnected, dreamlike haze. The next thing they knew, they were driving again. The rhythmic buzzing was gone. They found themselves 35 miles further down the road, with no memory of how they had traveled that distance. A profound sense of disorientation and confusion enveloped them. They looked at each other, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Their watches had stopped, and when they arrived home, they realized that 2 full hours of their journey were completely, unexplainably missing from their memory. The car bore strange circular marks on the trunk, and the compass they had on the dashboard now spun uselessly when brought near them. The physical evidence was scant, but unsettling. Betty's dress was torn and stained with a strange pink powder. Barney's best shoes were scuffed and scraped as if he had been dragged. In the days and weeks that followed, the missing time became a gaping hole in their shared reality, a psychological wound that refused to close. Betty began to have vivid, terrifying nightmares. She dreamed of being taken aboard the craft, of being led by silent, gray-skinned beings with large, wraparound eyes. She dreamed of a cold, metallic room and a long, painful examination. Barney, for his part, developed a cluster of circular warts near his groin, and his anxiety and ulcers, which had been under control, flared up with a vengeance. They tried to resume their normal lives, to file away the experience as a shared delusion or a trick of the mind on a dark, lonely road. But the psychological and physical aftershocks were too persistent. The memory of the silent, hovering craft and the 2 hours of lost time became the central, unspoken mystery of their lives, a shared trauma that would eventually lead them to seek help, not for a memory they had, but for a memory they had lost. Their journey home had ended, but their journey into the heart of an impossible mystery had just begun.
Chapter 5. Dr. Roger Lear's Surgeries, 1995. Surgeon removes suspected alien implants from bodies. The operating room of Dr. Roger Lear was a place of meticulous order and sterile precision. Gleaming stainless steel instruments lay in neat rows on a sterile blue cloth. The focused beam of the surgical lamp cut a circle of brilliant white light, banishing shadows. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of monitors and the soft rhythmic beeping of a heart rate tracker. In every respect, it was a typical surgical suite where the human body was repaired, where anomalies were removed and pathologies excised. Dr. Lear, however, was no typical surgeon. A respected podiatrist with decades of experience, he had, by the mid-1990s, embarked on a second, more controversial career. He was a surgeon who operated on the borderlands of scientific belief, a man who used the precise tools of his trade to investigate the claims of those who believed they carried fragments of another world within their very flesh. He became the reluctant pioneer in the surgical removal of suspected alien implants. His journey began not with a belief in aliens, but with a scientific curiosity piqued by the persistent stories of his patients. These were not wild-eyed fantasts, but ordinary people, teachers, mechanics, housewives, who came to him with similar, puzzling complaints. They spoke of strange, small, hard objects just beneath their skin, often in their feet, hands, or legs. Many of these individuals also had conscious or hypnotically retrieved memories of abduction experiences, memories that were often dismissed by the medical establishment as fantasy or psychological disturbance. But the small, hard lumps were real, palpable, and often visible on X-rays. For Dr. Lear, a man trained to trust physical evidence, this was a puzzle that demanded investigation. He decided to apply the rigorous methodology of his profession to these extraordinary claims. Between 1995 and his passing, he would perform 16 documented surgeries, extracting 17 separate objects that defied easy explanation. The atmosphere during these procedures was a unique blend of clinical routine and profound mystery. Dr. Lear and his team followed a strict protocol. They used specialized equipment, including a Gauss meter to detect magnetic fields and a frequency counter to scan for radio emissions before, during, and after the surgery. In case after case, the results were anomalous. The small area of the patient's body where the object was located would often emit a distinct electromagnetic field, which would vanish the moment the object was removed. The surgeries themselves were often strangely bloodless, the objects encased in a tough, dense, grayish membrane of the patient's own biological tissue, yet strangely free of any inflammatory or rejection response that would normally accompany a foreign body. It was as if the patient's own cells had been coerced into creating a protective, non-reactive cocoon for the foreign object. One of his earliest and most striking cases was patient number 1, a man who believed an object had been implanted in his jaw during an encounter. X-rays confirmed a small metallic-looking anomaly. During the surgery, Lear was astonished to find the object nestled against the bone, wrapped in that characteristic gray membrane. Once removed, it was a small, dark, metallic shard. But the true mystery began when the objects were sent to analysis to reputable laboratories, including the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, and Los Alamos National Laboratories. The analysis process was slow and methodical. Metallurgists and physicists subjected the tiny fragments to scanning electron microscopy, isotope analysis, and other advanced tests. The sentences describing their findings were precise, clinical, and utterly bewildering. The reports that came back were stunning. The objects were often composed of a complex mix of materials, including common elements like iron and silicon, but also rarer elements like ruthenium, iridium, and nickel, sometimes in isotopic ratios that were not found in nature on Earth. Some objects were crystalline in structure, appearing to have been manufactured at a molecular level. Patient number 17, from one of Lear's last documented surgeries, had a small, multi-layered object removed from his leg. Analysis revealed it contained carbon nanotubes, a technology that was in its infancy in human science at the time of the patient's reported abduction decades earlier. Furthermore, some of these objects continued to emit radio frequencies in the FM band long after they were removed from the body, as if powered by an unknown source. Dr. Lear, the podiatrist, found himself in possession of physical artifacts that pointed toward a technology far beyond our own. He was no longer just a surgeon. He was a custodian of evidence, evidence that was incredibly difficult for the mainstream scientific community to accept. The quiet, sterile environment of his operating room had become a gateway, a place where the barrier between a patient's story and a verifiable physical object was surgically breached.
The small, dark fragments on the lab slides were more than just medical curiosities. They were question marks made manifest, tangible pieces of an impossible puzzle.
Chapter 6. Bud Hopkins Research, 1981. Analysis reveals patterns and a reproductive focus. In the heart of New York City, far from the clinical sterility of surgical suites and the institutional quiet of psychiatrists' offices, another kind of investigation was unfolding. Bud Hopkins' art studio was a space defined by a creative, organized chaos. Canvases leaned against walls. The scent of oil paint and turpentine lingered in the air, a testament to his primary career as a respected abstract painter. But over time, the studio had transformed. Stacks of case files began to rival the stacks of canvases. Shelves once reserved for art history books now groaned under the weight of audio tapes, medical records, and binders filled with witness drawings. Hopkins' meticulous analytical mind, once dedicated to the interplay of form and color on canvas, had been captivated by a new, far more complex composition. The fragmented, terrifying, yet strangely consistent accounts of alien abduction. He had become an accidental archivist of the impossible, an artist-turned-investigator seeking patterns in the static of human testimony. Hopkins did not set out to find aliens. His journey began in 1975 with a single, compelling case. But as he spoke to more people, he began to notice something extraordinary. The stories, coming from individuals who had never met, who lived in different parts of the country, and who came from all walks of life, contained a shocking degree of similarity. The details of the beings, the descriptions of the examination rooms, the nature of the procedures, they all began to echo one another. Hopkins approached this growing mountain of data not with the credulity of a believer, but with the methodical rigor of an artist studying his subject. He cross-referenced accounts, he looked for corroborating witnesses, he documented physical evidence like landing site traces and bodily scars. His primary tool was regression hypnosis, a technique he learned and refined, seeing it not as a source of infallible truth, but as a key to unlock the door to a room of traumatic, buried memory. The atmosphere in his studio during these sessions was one of intense, empathetic focus, the whir of the tape recorder a quiet witness to the painful excavation of memory. As he collected more and more data, a disturbing and coherent pattern began to emerge from the chaos of individual stories. It was a narrative that was far more complex and troubling than simple, random visitations. The core of the phenomenon, as Hopkins' research suggested, was not about reconnaissance or casual curiosity. It was overwhelmingly focused on human biology, specifically on reproduction. Case after case under hypnosis revealed memories of gynecological and urological examinations, of sperm and ova being extracted. Men described procedures similar to what Barney Hill had recalled, a painful harvesting of genetic material. Women recounted exams that mirrored Betty Hill's memory of a pregnancy test, often involving long needles and probes. The emotional tone of these recollections was consistently of clinical detachment on the part of the beings and humiliation and violation on the part of the experiencer. This led Hopkins to his most controversial and terrifying conclusion. The abduction phenomenon appeared to be part of a large-scale, systematic, and clandestine genetic program. He documented numerous accounts from women who reported being abducted, impregnated, and then abducted again several months later, at which point the fetus would be removed. These women were left with the physical and psychological trauma of a lost pregnancy, with no conscious memory of what had transpired, only a deep sense of loss and confusion. In subsequent abductions, some of these women were shown a child that appeared to be a human-alien hybrid, and were encouraged to interact with it, to hold it, as if their maternal bond was a necessary component of the child's development.
Hopkins meticulously documented these presentation accounts, finding them to be one of the most emotionally devastating and consistent aspects of the phenomenon. In his studio, surrounded by the evidence, Hopkins saw the grand, terrible artistry of it all. The consistency of the medical procedures across cases was stunning. The focus on genetics, the creation of hybrids, the follow-up interactions, it all pointed to a long-term, goal-oriented project. He published his findings in books like Missing Time and Intruders, moving the conversation from "did it happen" to "why is it happening?" He was heavily criticized, accused of leading his witnesses and implanting false memories. Yet the patterns persisted, emerging from new cases with no connection to his own work. His art studio, once a place for creating abstract beauty, had become a center for mapping a phenomenon of terrifying specificity. Bud Hopkins, the artist, had painted a portrait, not on canvas, but across hundreds of case files. A portrait of a silent, systematic intrusion into the most private and fundamental aspects of human existence. The patterns he found in the data were not random splashes of color. They were the deliberate, repeating brushstrokes of an unseen, unknown, and unnervingly methodical hand.
Chapter 7. Dr. John Mack's Studies, 1994. Harvard psychiatrist deems abductions a real phenomenon. The office of Dr. John E. Mack at Harvard Medical School was a world of esteemed academia, a place where intellectual rigor and peer-reviewed evidence were the sacred pillars of truth. Mack himself was the embodiment of this world, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author for his biography of T.E. Lawrence, a tenured professor of psychiatry, and the founder of the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital. His reputation was impeccable. His office, with its view of the manicured Cambridge landscape, was a symbol of his professional success, a quiet bastion of psychoanalytic thought and respected scholarship. But by the early 1990s, this bastion of academic order had become the epicenter of a profound and career-threatening controversy. Dr. Mack, the respected Harvard psychiatrist, had begun to listen to the stories of people who claimed to have been abducted by aliens, and he was coming to believe them. His involvement began when Bud Hopkins, aware of the need for a respected psychiatrist to examine the psychological state of experiencers, referred several individuals to him. Mack initially approached the subject with the standard psychological and psychiatric frameworks in mind. He was a professional, trained to identify psychosis, fantasy proneness, and personality disorders. He expected to find evidence of mental illness, a psychological explanation for these extraordinary tales. He began conducting interviews, over 800 of them over the course of a decade, employing the deep, empathetic listening skills he had honed over a long career. The atmosphere in his office was not one of sensationalism, but of quiet, therapeutic exploration. He listened as pilots, secretaries, artists, and children recounted their experiences, their voices often trembling with the effort of articulating the unbelievable. What he found astounded him. The people sitting across from him did not fit the profile of mental disturbance. They were rational, functional individuals from all walks of life who were themselves struggling to make sense of their experiences. They were not seeking notoriety. They were seeking help for a trauma that was very real to them. Mack conducted extensive psychological testing and found no evidence of higher rates of psychopathology in the experiencer group compared to the general population. He noted their consistency, the sincerity of their emotional distress, and the profound, often transformative effect the experiences had on their lives.
Many reported a newfound sense of spiritual connection, a heightened environmental awareness, and a deep concern for the fate of the planet, as if the encounters had forcibly expanded their worldview. He began to think that these powerful, life-altering experiences were mere psychopathology, was a failure of the psychiatric profession itself. This led him to a professional and personal crossroads. His training, his colleagues, his entire academic world told him these experiences could not be physically real. But the evidence of his own senses, the testimony of hundreds of sane and suffering individuals, told him that something profound and real was happening. He was a psychiatrist, but he felt the psychological explanations were insufficient to contain the breadth and depth of the phenomenon. He began to entertain the possibility that these experiences were exactly what his patients, who he called experiencers to remove the pathological connotation of patient, said they were, real events. This was his dilemma. To pursue this line of inquiry was to risk everything: his reputation, his credibility, and his position at one of the world's most prestigious universities. It was a choice between professional security and what he was coming to see as a new, challenging, and essential truth. He chose truth. In 1994, he published Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens, a book that detailed his research and his conclusion that the abduction phenomenon was a genuine mystery that needed to be taken seriously. The backlash from the academic community was immediate and severe. Colleagues he had known for decades openly mocked him. The Harvard professor's dilemma became a public spectacle. The dean of Harvard Medical School launched a confidential 14-month-long investigation into Mac's clinical competence and professional judgment, a move that was virtually unprecedented for a tenured professor. The atmosphere in his Cambridge office grew heavy with the weight of this institutional pressure. He felt a profound sense of professional isolation, the cold judgment of his peers, a constant presence. He was forced to defend his methodology, his integrity, and his right to investigate a phenomenon that defied conventional understanding. In the end, the Faculty Review Committee reaffirmed his academic freedom to study what he wished and to state his opinions, but the controversy left a permanent mark. John Mack, the Pulitzer Prize winner, had become a pariah in the very institution that had once celebrated him, a powerful testament to the immense cost of applying the principles of open-minded inquiry to a subject that lay beyond the pale of accepted reality. Chapter 8. Whitley Strieber's Case, 1987. Author publicizes his experience, facing public ridicule. The dense woods of upstate New York possess a deep, primal quiet, especially in the dead of winter. For Whitley Strieber, an acclaimed author of horror fiction, the isolation of his family's cabin was a source of creative inspiration, a place where the boundary between the known and the unknown felt tantalizingly thin. On the night of December 26, 1985, that boundary would not just thin, it would completely dissolve. Strieber was a man who made his living from fear, a professional architect of terror who understood the mechanics of a good scare. He was, by his own admission, a skeptic when it came to UFOs and alien visitors, viewing them as material for fiction, not as a component of reality. The events of that night, and the nights that followed, would forcibly disabuse him of his skepticism, transforming him from a writer of horror into the subject of a terrifying real-life narrative that he himself could barely comprehend. The experience began abruptly, with a strange whirring, humming sound that seemed to fill the cabin. He awoke with a start, his mind groggy, to the sight of a small, non-human figure standing in his bedroom doorway. What followed was a chaotic, terrifying sequence of events that felt both hyper-real and utterly dreamlike. He recalled being floated out of his room, through the air, and into a clearing in the woods where a craft of some kind awaited him. The atmosphere was one of profound psychological terror, a complete and total loss of control that was far more horrifying than any monster he had ever conceived for his novels. The beings he encountered were varied. Some were short, robotic figures, while others were tall and slender, with large, black, mesmerizing eyes. The common thread was their silence, their efficiency, and their utter disregard for his terror. Strieber's recalled medical examination was brutally physical and detailed. His account, later documented with excruciating honesty in his book Communion, provided some of the most graphic and disturbing details of the abduction experience on public record. The sentences describing these procedures were short, sharp, and clinical, a reflection of the cold, precise, and invasive nature of the acts themselves. He described a thin, gray probe being inserted into his rectum, an intensely painful and humiliating procedure that left him screaming. He remembered a fine needle being inserted into his head, accompanied by a flash of light and a flood of unfamiliar images and memories, suggesting some form of neural interface. He was aware of a small incision being made on his finger and another object being placed behind his ear. The beings communicated with him telepathically, their thoughts a mixture of clinical observation and, at times, what felt like a strange, almost comical curiosity about his panicked human reactions. Chapter 9. Lear's Implant Analysis, 1995-2008. Implant analysis points to a non-terrestrial origin. The journey of a suspected alien implant, from its extraction in a sterile operating room to its final analysis, is a journey into the heart of a profound scientific enigma. It is a story told not in human language, but in the cold, precise dialect of mass spectrometry, isotopic ratios, and electron microscopy. The settings for this chapter of the abduction narrative are the hushed, climate-controlled laboratories of universities and private research institutes, places where the universe is broken down into its constituent parts and measured with astonishing precision. The atmosphere is one of methodical, dispassionate inquiry, yet beneath the surface lies a palpable tension, the quiet hope of a world-changing discovery, warring with the deeply ingrained skepticism of the scientific method. The primary characters are not people, but the objects themselves, small, enigmatic fragments of metal and crystal that should not exist. Once an object was surgically removed by a researcher like Dr. Roger Leir, a strict chain of custody was meticulously documented. Each transfer, each analysis was recorded to prevent any accusation of tampering or contamination. The object, often no bigger than a grain of rice, would be sent to a metallurgical laboratory. The first step of analysis was often a visual examination under a high-powered microscope. The analysts would note its complex, multi-layered structure, its unusual crystalline formations, and the presence of what appeared to be a biological coating, the remnants of the tough, fibrous membrane that had encased it within the body. Already there were anomalies. The objects often showed no signs of oxidation or corrosion one would expect from a foreign body, even one that had been inside a person for decades. The next stage of analysis involved determining the object's elemental composition. Using techniques like energy dispersive spectroscopy, scientists could bombard the sample with electrons and read the unique X-ray signatures that each element emits. The results were consistently baffling. The objects were not simple meteoritic fragments or terrestrial industrial waste. They were complex alloys, often containing a matrix of iron with inclusions of rarer elements like rhodium, iridium, or gallium. More perplexing was the discovery in some samples of isotopic ratios that differed significantly from the standard terrestrial ratio. Isotopes are versions of an element with different numbers of neutrons. On Earth, the ratio of one isotope to another for any given element is remarkably consistent all over the globe. Finding an object with, for example, a boron isotope ratio that did not match the terrestrial standard was a powerful indicator of a non-terrestrial, or at least an artificially altered, origin. These findings were stated in precise clinical sentences in lab reports, sentences that carried revolutionary implications. The B10 to B11 ratio is significantly depleted compared to the terrestrial standard. Further investigation revealed even stranger properties. Many of the objects were highly magnetic. Some were found to be emitting low-level radio frequencies even after being removed from the body, as if they contained a microscopic power source and transmitter. Perhaps the most stunning discovery was the presence of carbon nanotubes and nanofibers in some of the more recent samples. These were not just randomly arranged, but appeared to be woven into a complex, resilient matrix, a level of nanoengineering that was far beyond the public domain technology of the era in which the patient's initial abduction experience was reported to have occurred. The biological integration was another profound puzzle. The object's surface was often coated with the patient's own protein and blood cells, yet without any sign of inflammation, infection, or immune system rejection. It was a perfect, seamless biological interface, a form of stealth technology at the cellular level. The challenge, then, was not a lack of data, but an excess of anomalous data. Each finding, while scientifically verifiable, pushed the object further away from any known explanation. Peer review, the cornerstone of scientific progress, became a major hurdle. It was difficult to get these findings published in mainstream journals, as they were so far outside the accepted paradigm. Skeptics argued for terrestrial contamination or misinterpretation of the data. Yet the independent verifications, conducted at different labs by different scientists, kept yielding the same impossible results. The implant evidence occupied a strange limbo, too well documented to be dismissed as a hoax, yet too extraordinary to be accepted by the scientific establishment. The small, dark objects, sitting in sterile containers in laboratories around the world, remained as silent and enigmatic as the beings who allegedly put them there. Tangible artifacts from an unknown shore, awaiting a science advanced enough or open-minded enough to finally understand them. Chapter 10. Psychological Studies, 2000s. Skeptics explain with false memory, sleep paralysis. While surgeons and metallurgists were probing the physical evidence of the abduction phenomenon, another group of researchers was turning its powerful analytical tools inward, exploring the vast, complex territory of the human mind. The setting for this inquiry was not the operating room, but the sleep laboratory and the brain imaging suites of institutions like Harvard Medical School. Here, the atmosphere was one of cool, clinical objectivity. The focus was not on validating or debunking the stories, but on understanding the neurological and psychological processes of the people who told them. The central question was not, did this happen? but rather what is happening inside the brain of someone who believes this happened. This line of research, most famously championed by figures like the late psychologist Susan Clancy, sought to map the psychological landscape of the experiencer. Clancy and her colleagues approached the topic from a position of scholarly skepticism, armed with the latest knowledge of memory, trauma, and suggestibility. They conducted detailed studies with groups of individuals who reported abduction memories, comparing them to control groups. The methodology was rigorous. Participants were subjected to a battery of psychological tests to assess personality traits, fantasy proneness, and susceptibility to false memories. The research aimed to determine if there was a specific psychological profile for an abductee. The results of these studies were nuanced. While they found that the experiencer group did not show higher rates of serious mental illness, they did, on average, score higher on measures of fantasy proneness and schizotypy, a personality trait associated with unusual perceptual experiences. This suggested a predisposition, though not a pathology. The most compelling part of this research took place in sleep laboratories and fMRI machines. Researchers investigated the link between abduction experiences and sleep paralysis, a common and often terrifying condition in which a person wakes up but is temporarily unable to move, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. They found significant overlap between the classic description of an alien abduction, waking up paralyzed, sensing a presence in the room, seeing strange figures, and the known symptoms of a sleep paralysis episode. This led to the hypothesis that many abduction accounts could be highly elaborate, culturally influenced narratives constructed around a very real and frightening physiological event. The brain struggling to make sense of the paralysis and hallucinations might reach for the most culturally available explanation, the modern myth of the alien abductor. Further studies delved into the nature of memory itself. Research by cognitive psychologists like Elizabeth Loftus had already demonstrated that memory is not a perfect recording device, but a reconstructive process highly susceptible to suggestion and distortion. Clancy argued that the process of hypnotic regression, used by researchers like Bud Hopkins and John Mack, could inadvertently create rather than retrieve memories. A suggestible person, guided by a hypnotist who believes in the abduction narrative, might unconsciously construct a detailed, emotionally resonant memory that feels completely real but has no basis in external reality. The sentences used to describe this process were clinical and precise, focusing on concepts like source monitoring errors and confabulation. This research provided a powerful, science-based alternative framework for understanding the phenomenon, one that did not require the existence of actual aliens. This psychological approach was not without its critics. Many in the experiencer and research community felt it was reductionist, dismissing the profound and often transformative experiences, as well as the physical evidence like implants and landing traces that did not fit neatly into the false memory model. The neurological studies, however, continued. Brain imaging of individuals during hypnotic regression or while recalling their experiences sometimes showed heightened activity in the temporal lobes, an area of the brain known to be involved in mystical experiences, altered states of consciousness and memory. This finding was interpreted differently by both sides. For skeptics, it was evidence of a neurological quirk, a temporal lobe liability, that made these individuals prone to such experiences. For believers, it simply showed the brain's activity while it was interfacing with a real anomalous event. The psychological landscape of the abduction phenomenon remained a contested territory, a place where the firm ground of neuroscience met the murky, subjective depths of human consciousness. The research provided plausible explanations, yet for many experiencers, the cold data of brain scans and personality tests could never fully capture the felt reality of their incredible journeys. Chapter 11. Global Patterns, 1950s to Present. Emergence of Abduction Reports, from around the world. The abduction phenomenon, far from being a uniquely American fixation, has woven its strange narrative into the cultural fabric of nations across the globe. To truly grasp its scope, one must move beyond the familiar cases of North America and into the wider world, to the academic conferences in Europe, the remote villages of South America, and the bustling cities of Asia. The setting for this chapter is not a single location, but a global network of researchers, investigators, and experiencers connected by the Internet and a shared, perplexing mystery. The atmosphere is one of academic collaboration and cross-cultural comparison as investigators piece together a puzzle whose pieces are scattered across continents and languages. The central theme is the astonishing consistency of the core experience, a signal that seems to cut through the noise of cultural interpretation. In Europe, the phenomenon has been studied with a quiet, often discreet rigor. French researchers from GAPON, a unit within the French Space Agency, have investigated cases with a characteristically methodical and cautious approach. In Italy, the late Dr. Corrado Malanga, a professor of organic chemistry at the University of Pisa, conducted thousands of hypnotic regressions, developing his own complex theories about alien interference in human consciousness. British investigators like Nick Pope, who once ran the UFO desk for the Ministry of Defense, have spoken of credible reports from military personnel and ordinary citizens alike, reports that were taken seriously at the highest levels of government. Across these varied European cultures, the core elements of the abduction narrative remained remarkably stable. The silent craft, the short, gray beings with large eyes, the missing time, and the clinical, often reproductive-focused examinations. The phenomenon takes on a different, sometimes more visceral character in South America, particularly in Brazil, a country with a long and rich history of UFO sightings. The 1957 case of Antonio Villas-Boas, a young farmer, predates the Hill case and contains many of the now classic elements, including a detailed account of being taken aboard a craft and forced to have sexual contact with a female being. The famous Colares incident of 1977 saw a rash of sightings of strange lights dubbed chupa chupa, sucker sucker, which allegedly fired beams at local residents, leaving them with puncture marks and anemia. The Brazilian Air Force launched Operation Saucer to investigate, generating hundreds of photographs and hours of film, much of which remains classified, though some has been released, confirming the reality of the anomalous phenomena. The consistency with North American and European reports, the medical procedures, the biological sampling, the implant-like markings is striking. Even in cultures with vastly different mythologies and spiritual beliefs, the same basic patterns emerge. In Asia and Africa, where stories of alien abduction are less common, the accounts that do surface often get interpreted through a local cultural lens, sometimes being described as encounters with spirits, demons, or legendary creatures. Yet when the folkloric overlay is peeled back, the underlying structure of the event, the non-human entities, the temporary paralysis, the medical examination, the lost time, is often hauntingly familiar. This cross-cultural consistency is perhaps the most compelling and challenging piece of evidence for those who study the phenomenon. It argues against the idea that these are purely cultural constructions, like tales of vampires or werewolves, which tend to be geographically and historically contained. The modern abduction narrative appears to be a global phenomenon, a standardized experience reported by people with no knowledge of each other or the broader literature on the subject. Documentation from government files and military testimonies from around the world, slowly declassified over decades, further corroborates the existence of a persistent, worldwide mystery that has been tracked by official sources for over 70 years. The sheer volume and global distribution of these reports suggest that something real is happening, something that transcends language, culture, and geography, leaving the same strange mark on human lives from Pascagoula to the plains of Brazil, from the mountains of New Hampshire to the quiet suburbs of France.
Chapter 12. Support Groups. Modern Day. Abductees find healing and community with others. The journey ends not with a grand revelation or a definitive answer, but in the quiet, unassuming basement of a community center. The setting is a support group meeting for experiencers. The fluorescent lights overhead hum softly, a stark contrast to the otherworldly lights that haunt their memories. A mismatched collection of chairs is arranged in a circle, a simple geometry of inclusion and safety. The air smells of brewed coffee and quiet understanding. Here, in this circle of shared secrets, are the people who have lived the stories of the preceding chapters. Not the famous names from the history books, but ordinary individuals who carry the same extraordinary burden. There is a retired teacher who still has a small, hard lump in her leg. A young man who struggles with nightmares after a missing time episode on a camping trip. A woman who carries a deep, unspoken grief for a pregnancy that inexplicably vanished. They are the living legacy of the phenomenon, the human face of the mystery. The focus in this room is not on proving what happened, but on learning to live with it. The atmosphere is one of gentle, non-judgmental acceptance. For many here, this is the only place they can speak their truth without fear of ridicule or psychiatric diagnosis. The conversations are soft, punctuated by long, comfortable silences. They don't rehash the terrifying details of their encounters. They talk about the aftermath. They share strategies for coping with anxiety, for dealing with the lingering sense of violation, for integrating a reality-shattering experience into an ordinary life. They discuss the subtle shifts in their perception, the heightened empathy, the newfound spiritual awareness, the profound sense of connection to the planet and the cosmos. The trauma is real, but so is the transformation. It is a slow, methodical process of rebuilding a life in the shadow of an incomprehensible event. A man in his 50s, a mechanic with calloused hands, speaks about the difficulty of feeling alienated from his own friends and family, of living with a secret that is too large to share. A woman across the circle nods in recognition, her eyes welling with tears, not of sadness, but of relief at being so completely understood. In this space, their psychological resilience is nurtured. They are not victims, but survivors. They are not abductees, a passive term, but experiencers, a title that reclaims their agency. They have faced the inexplicable and have found a way to continue, to find meaning and purpose in the wake of it. They are the living proof of the human capacity to adapt, to endure, and to find community in the most isolating of circumstances. The researchers, the Macks, the Hopkinses, the Lears, provided a framework for understanding, but it is here, in these quiet circles, that the real healing happens. The meeting winds down. The coffee cups are cleared away, and the chairs are stacked against the wall. People exchange quiet hugs and words of encouragement.
As they step out into the cool night air, they look up at the familiar canopy of stars, but they see it with different eyes. For them, the night sky is no longer just a beautiful abstract expanse. It is a space that holds a profound and personal mystery. It is both the source of their deepest trauma and the catalyst for their greatest growth. They have learned to live with the unanswered questions, to find a strange peace in the acceptance of the unknown. The final reflection is not of fear, but of a quiet, enduring dignity. The phenomenon, whatever its ultimate origin, has revealed something fundamental about the human condition, our deep-seated need for truth, our remarkable resilience in the face of terror, and our profound ability to find community in the shared landscape of our deepest mysteries. Some truths may lie forever beyond our grasp, just out of reach in the vast, silent darkness between the stars. But the courage and dignity of the human spirit, in its relentless quest to understand, persists.